All good to go. Wonderful. We're asking the question, well, I've got up there, what is a race? All right. This is actually adapted from a program which we did a while back. In fact, we've done it a few times on Creation Conversations. In fact, if I recall correctly, I believe the first ever live stream we ever did, even before Creation Conversations, was actually on this topic. One blood, many races. It's a controversial topic, but it's one that is much needed to delve into and get some clarifications. But the reason why I chose to do this one, or an adaptation of this one, is because it is dealing with Neanderthals. And Neanderthals are actually one of those creatures, humans, people, whatever you want to classify them as, that many of the creationists want to try and classify as a separate species. So it's well worth delving down into it and looking a little bit deeper. Here's a little intriguing thing. When we first did this presentation, it was right back at the beginning, right, of COVID-19. We're sort of 3 years on from that, and thankfully just about over it, although the States is still fairly closed down to outsiders. It says here, DNA inherited from Neanderthals may increase risk of COVID-19. Of course, you do have to, as humorous as it is, dig a little bit deeper. DNA inherited from Neanderthals. So that means we not only can, but we have inherited DNA from Neanderthals. Now, that should tell you a lot about the relationship between Neanderthals and us. It should tell you a lot about whether they are a same or different species. But delve a little bit deeper, and we're going to find ourselves pretty quickly at a rather famous hymn. In fact, this hymn was actually used in the late great Queen Elizabeth the Great's diamond jubilee. It was a very famous hymn, beautiful hymn. Praise to the Lord, the Almighty, the King of creation. O my soul, praise him, for he is thy health and salvation. All ye who hear, now to his temple draw near. Praise him in glad adoration. All right, the author of the hymn, who actually wrote this, there he is there, Joachim Neander, 1680, a German Reformed pastor, theologian, and hymn writer. And he and his family were so famous that he actually ended up having a valley named after him, which is the Neander Valley. In fact, Neanderthal or Neanderthal actually means the Neander Valley in German. So just as Diane mentioned earlier, there's the Neander Valley or the Neanderthal, and that's where the Neanderthal skeleton was actually found. So don't be scared and worried about long and complicated and technical names. They often mean things very, very simple, and they often have a rather fascinating history behind them. And it's certainly the true for the Neanderthal skeletons. Now, since that first Neanderthal skeleton, Neanderthal 1, was found many, many years back, there's been lots and lots of other Neanderthal evidence found, both not just the skeletons, but also skeletons of children, as well as artifacts, drawings, stuff like that, which we're going to delve into a little bit now. But let's just run down through a few different ideas, because the way that we think about Neanderthals has changed over the years. You see, when Neanderthals were first discovered, evolutionary natural historians, and then later biologists, and then later anthropologists and archaeologists kind of developed the way that they thought about Neanderthal skeletons. To begin with, they believed that Neanderthals were ape men. So they believed that they were kind of missing links, right? A bit similar to how Lucy would end up being described, as Diane was talking earlier. They believed that Neanderthals were somewhere in that ancestry between apes and humans, things that were, not quite apes, not quite humans, somewhere in between. Now, it is true the first ever Neanderthal skeleton wasn't the best preserved. There were problems with it. There certainly seemed to be some kind of bone disease and stuff with it as well. But the reality is we've found so many more Neanderthal skeletons, and we've found so much more evidence of Neanderthals. The old sort of creationist idea that, Neanderthals were just a, arthritic sort of, human, with old man with rickets or whatever, doesn't really stand up anymore. But then neither does the evolutionary idea that they were ape men, because later they said, well, okay, maybe the Neanderthals aren't quite the missing link, but they must be human ancestors. So they're a little bit closer to being humans than perhaps before. And then they said, well, no, that doesn't really quite fit. Maybe they were distantly related to humans. So maybe the human ancestor branched off into humans and Neanderthals. And then when you start digging down into the genome and to the genetics of these kind of things, They argue that, well, actually, there's an ability to interbreed with the so-called Neanderthals and modern humans. So maybe they're distant cousins and we actually share quite a close common ancestor. And now many academic writing and many scientists consider Neanderthals as humans. In fact, they've been reclassified as Homo sapien variation neanderthalensis. And we'll talk about what that variation term means. But even without that variation neanderthalensis, which is really sort of an evolutionary terminology, leftover terminology, the reality is they're regarded by modern secular academics as Homo sapien, as human beings. And so we've ended up essentially with a complete reclassification of Neanderthals, of those skeletons first found in the Neander Valley. So Homo sapien variation, or var neanderthalensis, that's what they're now referred to as. Okay, creationist ideas. When Neanderthals were first found, in fact, one of the earliest writings said that these are just human beings. One of the earliest doctors who studied them just said, look, there's really no difference between these. Maybe there's a little bit of difference in some of the bone structure, but nothing that's big enough to be able to classify as a different species. And many people today, creationists today, promote the idea that Neanderthals were humans. Some people argue that Neanderthals were part of the one race, people who want to argue that there is only one race of man and that God created one race. There's some who argue that Neanderthals were just arthritic with bone disease due to the lack of vitamin D. Others argue that Neanderthals were just very old. So this is what happens if you get to live to, the age of Noah up to 1,000 years old, you start to look like a Neanderthal. And others claim that maybe Adam was a Neanderthal. In other words, maybe the Neanderthals are the original humans. That's what we originally looked like when God created us. And others claim that, well, actually, there's no difference between Neanderthals and us. We're just the Europeans, just a bit further down the line. Now, they're all interesting ideas, but there are some rather wacky creationist ideas as well, which we need to really put to bed. One of them is that, well, Neanderthals didn't exist. They're just forgeries. They're forgeries. They're frauds that evolutionists have made up to deny the Bible. Well, the reality is we have Neanderthal tools on display in our museum. We've studied Neanderthal bones. We have casts of the many Neanderthal skulls. One thing is for sure, Neanderthals did certainly exist. They're not hoaxes in the slightest. They are real fossils. They're real fossil humans. Neanderthals were not humans, but the genetic mutants created from demons and humans. That's another idea that we've heard bandied about. Perhaps these are, the Nephilim that Genesis 6 refers to. Well, Nephilim is an entirely different topic, which we won't get into today, but the reality is everything that we can see from their genes shows, as we mentioned earlier, it's a human genome for sure. Nothing to do with demons and angels or anything else. Other people believe that perhaps Neanderthals were the giants mentioned both in Genesis chapter 6, but also later in the book of Numbers. But, well, like I said, we've dug up Neanderthal fossils. Now, it is true that generally speaking, Neanderthal skeletons that we find are bigger, stockier, stronger, but we're certainly not talking anything that we would refer to as giants. Others believe that Neanderthals were the cause of Noah's flood, again referring back to that Nephilim idea, and then this rather interesting idea that is a fairly new one in the creationist world, that Neanderthals are a different species of human. And the reality is all of these are not only wacky, they are very, very wrong. And let's have a look a little bit deeper and find out exactly what Neanderthals are. Well, what do we know about Neanderthals? Well, like I said, we've found their tools. We have many of their tools on display in our museum collections. We've now found paintings which can be attributed to Neanderthals. We obviously have skeletons, and both John and Glenn have copies of their Neanderthal or casts of their Neanderthal skeletons with them tonight. We have several casts of Neanderthal skeletons here in our UK museum collection, although not with me tonight. And John has even been to the original valley where they're found, and you can go and study in many museums around the world these actual skeletons and skulls. And perhaps most recently, the work has been done into their DNA. The bones have actually had enough preservation in them so that we can extract DNA and get a decent sequence of it. And as we mentioned earlier, the sort of term Neanderthal genome is a misnomer. It's a human genome with a Neanderthal variant, and it's well worth making sure you understand the difference between the two. Well, let's actually look through each of these pieces of evidence and see if we can work out what Neanderthals are. Are they any one of these creationist ideas? Are they any one of these evolutionary ideas? Or how can we actually get to the bottom of this? Well, there's a example of one of the Neanderthal tools that we actually have in our museum collection. It's from a very, very famous Neanderthal site in France. In fact, we've been exploring one of the Neanderthal sites on Jersey, one of the most important ones in the British Isles, just in the last few days, and we'll be bringing you some video footage of that in a little while, in the next week or so, when we've got home and edited it all together. This is a quote from the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences a couple of years back, so by no means it's a very prestigious institute. Neanderthals were not the dumb brutes once thought, but showed an incredible level of sophistication through their tool making and craftsmanship. You see, specific tool making for a purpose not only is indicative of human creativity, but it also shows you that you have an ability which apes don't have, namely that you're able to touch your all four fingers to your thumb, right? You require that to be able to grip things in certain ways, to be able to strike and create such sophisticated tools. So purely by the tools, you can't really see any difference between Neanderthals and human beings. Intelligently designed tools for an intelligent purpose certainly equals humans. I mean, think what apes can cope with. They can pick up a rock and they can smash a nut with it. They can pick up a stick and stick it in the anthill, but they don't really do much more than that. To be able to craft a tool for a specific purpose, to be able to fit it together in a handle and use it as an axe, or to be able to carve your tool so that it fits comfortably in only your left or your right hand, shows an intelligent design. An intelligent design that equals humanity. Well, Neanderthal paintings, again, reported on in the National Geographic, again, fairly prestigious. The findings suggest that Neanderthals and modern humans had the same cognitive abilities based off of their paintings. I mean, these are some of the examples from their paintings, actually fairly sophisticated stuff. And you'll often find that the anatomical drawings of animals and people in many of these cave paintings, both Neanderthals and other so-called Stone Age cave paintings, are actually far more anatomically correct than even many of the much later, medieval paintings. Intelligently designed paintings equals humanity. You see, we're dealing with something that is creative, something that is artwork, and something that requires you to have a specially created, a specially designed hand so that you're able to hold and paint and produce such things in ways that animals simply cannot. All right, well, let's have a look at their skeletons. I mean, the skeletons, yeah, you can see there's some differences in them. There's some subtle differences in the specific morphology. But then again, if you lined up the many different people groups that there are in the world, their skeletons, you'll find that some are bigger, some are skull is shaped differently, some of the bones are shaped differently. There certainly is variation. There certainly is minor changes, but certainly not anywhere near what we're dealing with when comparing a human and an ape skull together. You see, the skeleton is definitely human. It's designed to walk upright. It's designed to be able to use hands in a creative way. It's designed to be able to do the things that God created it to do because he created them in his image, just like the rest of humans. But exactly the same? Well, there are some of those minor differences. Here's one of them. In fact, one of the presentations we could have done tonight is an excellent presentation that Diane does, which I believe we've done before on Creation Conversations. It's called Brain Drain, and I recommend you go and actually find that. Maybe we'll try and find it and put it up as a standalone clip. But on the left-hand side, you can see what is often referred to as a modern human skull. On the right-hand side is the so-called Neanderthal skull. Now, can you see a difference? Well, yes, there certainly is. Every single characteristic of a human being is there in the right-hand side skull, such as the brow of the nose, which chimps don't have, such as the shape of the jaw, which chimps don't have, and this is uniquely human. Everything about it says that it is a human, but there are some differences, specifically things like the brain capacity. Yes, Neanderthals had a larger brain than modern humans. Now, if you compare that to, say, an ape skull, as both John and Diane were mentioning earlier, ape skulls generally are much, much smaller. You'll find that with Neanderthals, the bone density is stronger. Now, that's a good thing. You've got a harder head. Doesn't equal Brutus, or brutishness, or stupidness. It's actually a good thing. Muscle strength certainly seems to be a lot stronger, and you can tell by the way that muscles and ligaments fit into the bones. Right? If you use your dominant hand, most of us have a dominant hand, right hand, left hand. You'll find that the bones tend to be stronger and indicate good muscle strength. The size is slightly different. It's a bit larger, a bit stockier, a bit sturdier. Yes, there is a bit of a brow, and you've got that little bit of a bun on the back of the skull, but even though you've got these minor differences, which are actually indicative of a healthier and stronger and more intelligent human being, you are certainly dealing with a human from the skeleton. And finally, you have DNA. Now, what we have isolated here are the sort of number coding, which is attributed to certain gene variations which are unique to Neanderthals. They're referred to as the Neanderthal variants. They're in a human genome for sure, but here's some of the variants. Now, you'll find that if you again compare things like somebody from a Caucasian descent, somebody from an African descent, somebody from an Asian descent, you'll find the skin colors will be slightly different variants. You'll find that there'll be different variants within these different people groups. So there's really no difference between Neanderthals and other different people groups that there are today. These are all distinct gene variations to what are referred to as modern humans, but they're all still part of the human genome. In fact, many of these variants can be found in the so-called modern humans as well. You see, this remnant DNA is found in modern humans of Northern European descent predominantly, but they are found elsewhere. They are part of human DNA, they're part of the human genome, but they are different variations from other races or people groups of human. You see, the Neanderthal is a race of human, but not a race in the evolutionary sense, certainly not a race in the species sense, but they are certainly part of the created human being. When God created Adam and Eve, Adam and Eve were originally created in the perfect image of God. However, this perfect image has become marred and corrupted by sin, as you can read about in Genesis chapter 3 and Genesis chapter 5. But these people are closer to the original creation. So they're bigger, they're stronger, and they're more intelligent. You see, the reality is Neanderthals are simply human beings, descended not only from Adam, but also from Noah, spread out at the time of the Tower of Babel and the Table of Nations recorded in Genesis chapter 10 and Genesis chapter 11. Every single thing that we can see about them show that they are simply human beings, not a different species, not a different kind, a different race in the sense that we have multiple races today, different distinct human variations, but not a different species, not a different creature, not a different animal by any stretch of the imagination.